Hey, good afternoon, everybody. I am Mike Lydon. I want to welcome you to the On the Park Bench, a public square conversation brought to you by the Congress for the New Urbanism. This webinar series, On the Park Bench, presents interactive conversations with thought leaders in new urbanism and allied industries, providing an opportunity for the audience to engage in real time. The webinar series is intended to be weekly to provide a platform for CNU members to engage, debate, as we often do, and collaborate on the pressing and emerging issues we're all facing right now. This is our final webinar before the CNU 28 virtual gathering, which is coming up in about 10 days. So the series will pick back up in July, so stay tuned for all of that. As a plug, a lot of us are used to gathering in person every year in May or June for the annual Congress. This year is the 28th Congress, and it was slated to be in Minneapolis. Unfortunately, because of the pandemic, we will not be able to be together this year. But the Congress and the conference must go on, so it will be held virtually. So you can learn more and register and see all the great lineup of speakers and sessions that are slated for the Congress at the link that you see on the screen. I will bring this up again at the end so you have it towards the end of this webinar. I'm really excited about this group of people who are joining us today in this conversation. These are folks who I either know personally from working closely with on projects or have known their work and been excited about their work and the things that they advocate for in cities across the globe. To date, the On the Park Bench webinar series has been, I think, primarily focused on domestic issues, but obviously the pandemic and how cities are responding is really varied across the globe. And so I want to bring in some of those voices and perspective experts are co-managing this crisis where they sit and where they work and advocate. So I'm really pleased to have Maria Titsiglu here from the Oasis Schoolyards Project, which is based in Paris, France. Maria is from Thessaloniki, Greece. She has extensive experience in urban resilience projects with a portfolio ranging from policy to design to hands-on community engagement. I had the pleasure of working with Maria in Thessaloniki several years ago. Her specific focus is on developing child-friendly cities, something that she's an advisor for with the 100 Resilient Cities Network. And with her current project, the Oasis Schoolyards Project, she is the leader of that effort and appointed by the European Commission as the urban expert in that subject matter. Maria has an MS, as a master's in urban design from UC Berkeley, and a master's degree in architecture from Democritus University of Thrace in Greece. Maria will start first, but I will continue to introduce the panel here so we get this out of the way. Next, we'll have Marcela Guerrero Casas, who lives in Cape Town, but is from Bogota, Colombia, which is where she was raised. She's passionate about cities, public spaces, and most importantly, people. I know Marcela's work primarily through Open Streets in Cape Town. She started a nonprofit organization there to bring open streets to the city for the first time and to build up that program as a leading grassroots organization promoting sustainable mobility, citizen participation in communities around the city. She is a member of the World Economic Forum's Global Council on Mobility and also is a co-founder of Otrasur, a platform for cultural exchange between Latin American and sub-Saharan African countries. She holds a master's in public administration and international affairs from Syracuse University and has worked in policy and advocacy for over a decade in organizations including the Carter Center, Civicus, the World Alliance for Citizen Participation, and Fair Trade Africa. Next, we'll hear from Robin Mazumder. Robin is actually a neuroscientist, which is really cool, but he focuses on cities and the health of our cities. He's currently a doctoral candidate in cognitive neuroscience at the University of Waterloo, where he's studying the psychological impacts of urban design. His research is inspired by his passion for urbanism, his frontline experience working as an occupational therapist in mental health, and his interest in human-centered design. He graduated with a master's in occupational therapy from the University of Toronto in 2011 and completed training in design thinking in 2015 with Stanford's D School. Robin's doctoral research is funded by the Vanier Canada Graduate Scholarship, Canada's most prestigious doctoral award. He has served on the boards of numerous civic initiatives, including Make Something Edmonton, Reach Edmonton, Council for Safe Communities, and the Mayor's Task Force to End Poverty. And then finally, last but not least, is my friend Charles Brown. Charles Brown serves as a senior researcher with the Allen M. Voorhees Transportation Center and is an adjunct professor at the Edward J. Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy, both at Rutgers University. So obviously Charles is representing the US perspective in this conversation today. He also serves as a 2020 fellow with the Yale program on climate change communication in partnership with the Op-Ed Project. His recent and notable contributions through research and practice include understanding barriers to biking and walking for women and minorities, analyzing the impact of crime on walking frequency and propensity, centering and prioritizing equity in transportation planning and decision-making, analyzing barriers to accessing parks and open spaces, and serving as an instructor for the Smart Growth America, National Transit Institute, Federal Transit Administration, FTA, and the Federal Highway Administration and CDC's Walkability Action Institute. This panel, guys, is full of skills and full of experience. And what my role today is to kind of draw out some early conversation from them on their perspective, how they're dealing with the pandemic and how that's impacting the public realm where they live and work. So I'm going to turn it over to Maria to talk about her experience right now. And each speaker will have 2 to 3 minutes to give a brief overview. And then we will move on directly into more conversational Q&A, which I will moderate. So with that, I'll hand it over to Maria. Thanks.
Hey, Maria, you might need to click unmute on your screen.
I just did. Sorry. Hello, I'm Maria, and thank you, Mike, for inviting me in this very interesting and international discussion. So since I'm the first one and I am the only one from Europe, I think that it will be good to give you an overview of how cities around here are actually responding to this current challenge of COVID-19 and keeping physical distancing. So it seems that in Europe here, we began taking action a little bit after the first US cities began doing a few things. But what we see as an overview till the moment is that cities are taking bold actions. And we see that major cities are using plans they have been developing, long-term plans, such as sustainable urban mobility plans or other urban regeneration plans, and they are trying to implement parts of it, strategic parts of those plans, even in a temporary way. So for example, Paris has been extending the bike network and aiming to have like a total length of 650 kilometers across the city, or even Athens has just recently announced that they will create a total area of 50 hectares car-free located at the historic city center. And I'm just mentioning a few because more or less I think people know about the big announcements that European cities have made and their progress in it. But and all this is great news. And it's amazing that we are now at the moment that cyclists and pedestrians are now being prioritized in urban planning. However, there's still not much discussion in many cities yet on the neighborhood scale. And I think that it is an opportunity now to discuss across cities and across countries, what do we do in neighborhood scale? And also, what do we do to respond to the needs of all users? So we have seen that during these times, during lockdown and post-lockdown, people spend more time in their neighborhoods, and more public spaces like parks or playgrounds are being closed. Not everyone yet, now starting to open, but the neighborhood street becomes a multifunctional public space at the moment. And does that, the solutions and the interventions that we are actually deciding now, do they respond to the needs of all users? And I wanted to raise the issue of the children well-being and the needs of children. And because we've seen here in Greece for the moment that children don't have enough public space to actually interact and play outdoors because they are limited to their neighborhoods, which are not, it actually lacks of parks and efficient public space. So I think that it is a great opportunity to discuss how street solutions that we are deciding now and street interventions are considering, for example, informal play or nature, or even safe play and interaction between children. Because just to mention, according to United Nations, 60% of children worldwide live in cities that are, during the past few months, have been under partial or full lockdown. And for example, in Spain, children were not allowed to go outdoors for 6 weeks. And this actually has a significant impact to their development and their well-being. So here we are, all practitioners, because I would like to raise this question and discuss it further with you and exchange experiences in that. And with this, I would like to turn it over to Marcela.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Maria. If it's okay with you, Claire, I'm going to share my screen. Mike already explained I'm Colombian by birth, but I've lived in South Africa for a long time. It's been 13 years now. I did spend the last 13 months in Colombia. And so I thought that I would reflect very briefly on my observations of what's happened since COVID in both places, acknowledging that they're very different places and that I will do no justice in 2 minutes. But there were 3 things that came to mind when Mike asked us to reflect on what we've been observing, and they are the following. The first is that things are happening in places where a prior culture exists. In a culture, I mean cycling, walking, that type of thing. The second point is that public space is responding to emerging needs, things that we might have not anticipated, but that COVID, has surfaced. And then the final thing is that we are going local, which is very much what you pointed out, Maria, on how people are really focusing at the neighborhood level. So on the first point, I think it's been really inspiring to see what's happening in places like Bogota, because bicycle lanes are popping up everywhere and people are getting on bicycles to use that temporary infrastructure. But I think what's really important to highlight is that it doesn't come from nowhere. And so there is a Ciclovia program. I'm sure most of the audience knows about this weekly program, which has inspired the Open Streets programs around the world. And so every Sunday, there is this network of car-free streets. And the infrastructure that you see on the photo there, at the top on the left, is what's happening right now, but it is part of the route that normally becomes car-free during a weekend. So the infrastructure being the cones, the actual people monitoring intersections are there, and they've just been redeployed for this purpose. And so I think that similar things are happening in Europe, where pre-existing plans were there, like, the Milan story is really inspiring. But I think it's important to acknowledge that those plans were there prior to COVID, and this is why, the timing is sort of appropriate, or it works. And my second point, which is about public space responding to the emerging needs, the images that I'm sharing here are of physical distancing and soup kitchens in a township called Kailicha outside of Cape Town. And this is how public space is being used. At the top, you see a street, a small, quiet neighborhood street. The middle photo is the same. It's also on a street where people are responding to the need of food relief. And then the final photo you see at the bottom, which speaks to my third point, which is, how we're going local and how we're utilizing public space in that sense, is literally just using chalk to demarcate the physical distancing that's being suggested by government. On this final point, I just wanted to share that I've been involved in a community response to COVID that has created this organic community action networks. And it is through these groups that these initiatives are sort of, emerging and happening all over the city. And I think that there's a lot of power there. particularly because those are the communities, as Maria pointed out, that know exactly what is required, what is needed. So copy and paste never worked. It's not going to work now, specifically because of what COVID is bringing to the surface. So those are some general thoughts to get us going, and again, look forward to a bigger discussion, longer discussion. With that, I want to hand it over to Robin.
Still seeing Marcella's screen. Okay, great. Thanks, Marcella. It's an honor to be here. Thanks to Mike for organizing and bringing this all together. So for context, right now I'm doing my PhD in cognitive neuroscience, and I study how people experience cities. So I try to understand their emotional experiences and how the built environment shapes how we feel and function. But that interest was actually inspired by my clinical work as an occupational therapist. And so occupational therapists pay particular attention to how environments affect well-being. And so actually Maria's point about the impacts on child development was actually quite fascinating to me. I think we have to think about how these decisions around policy that affect the public realm are actually going to shape, the next generation. This is a really crucial time in their lives. In terms of what's happening in Canada, I mean, we're a country that's typically quite slow to move when it comes to building infrastructure. And so accordingly, I think we've seen relative to Europe and other places, slow responses. Many cities have chosen at the outset to close parks and police people and ensure physical distancing through fines. In Ottawa, a man was given an $880 fine for walking his dog through a park on his own. At the same time, cities like Calgary led the way by opening streets. However, I think that one of the challenges I see in Canadian cities is the inclination to open streets in core areas, typically areas that are affluent, areas that already have some infrastructure. And my biggest concern in terms of the Canadian conversation is, the disparities that already exist. I think people make some assumptions about Canada. We're a great country. We have a really cool prime minister and we seem progressive, but we have a lot of issues here, typically as they relate to race and class. And so what I think is exciting is the opportunity. We've been shown that change doesn't need to take that much time. Our cycling master plans in most Canadian cities are 10 to 20 years long, and it takes decades to get a little bit of infrastructure installed, particularly for cycling infrastructure. But what we're seeing on a global scale, I think, is kind of challenging our decision makers and showing the public that we can transform our cities overnight. And accordingly, these are going to have implications on health and well-being. And I think we have to have a bigger conversation about infrastructure on our streets, but also public space and park space. I don't know if anyone saw, but we made national news and probably international news about Trinity Bellwoods Park in Toronto, where 10,000 people showed up to party. And there's a lot of conversation around blaming and shaming, but we need to be tough on people and reprimand them. But I also think that we need to understand their behavior in context. And if you look at the social climate around finding people and creating a culture of fear when the opportunity comes, and there's some mixed messaging around how people should engage in the public realm, you get things like this happening, and that's only going to make the pandemic worse. So Canada has been slow to move, but I think more cities are getting it, and this is just going to be an opportunity to not only change what's going to be happening in our cities right now during the pandemic, but the future. And so accordingly, Jen Keesmaat, former chief planner of City of Toronto, organized what she called a 2020 declaration, which I was a signatory on, and it's a list of recommendations for cities that address equity, sustainability, and mobility. And if you're interested, whoever's watching, you can just go to 2020declaration.ca, where you can see some actual tangible, concrete suggestions that can help, improve the public realm in the long term. And sorry, with that, I'll pass it on to Charles.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks to Mike, Claire, and CNU for the opportunity to speak to everyone today. It is certainly a pleasure to be here with you. I would like to start with a second or two for silence for Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd, who were both African Americans who were murdered on our very streets here in America. And so following that moment of silence to recognize their lives, I think it's important to kind of help contextualize things as it relates to mobility and the sort of equity implications of COVID-19 in America. For one, what we know in the US, the old adage is that when white America catches a cold, Black America gets pneumonia. This has become sort of a very chilling reality for many of us. If you've been watching the latest news, what we know is that low-income and minority communities, specifically Black and Latino communities, are being hit hardest by COVID-19. In fact, recent data coming out of New York, Chicago, and Louisiana indicate that the deaths from COVID-19 are disproportionately high among communities of color. These are, unfortunately, the very communities that lack access to or safe access to public space, public transportation, and many of the micromobility options that many of us have an opportunity to enjoy. And so consistently throughout these discussions within the American context, we're hearing from transportation engineers, planning professionals, and others that now represents an opportunity for change. But what we have to do is kind of pause and consider what we mean by change and how will we leverage this opportunity to help eradicate the very issues that have plagued these communities. And so I would like to start with a quote by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. This quote talks about the urgency of now. And it goes, we are now faced with the fact that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. This is no time for apathy or complacency. This is a time for vigorous and positive action. So what I would like to do by kicking things off is challenge my colleagues, my friends around the world, to consider how COVID-19 is impacting communities of color, specifically Black and Latino communities. And in a collaborative way, let's come up with some solutions that lead to a disproportionate investment now positively in those communities to help eradicate those issues. So thank you for giving me the time to kick this off. And I'm going to hand it over to Mike for questions.
Great. Thank you all. You all raise really important issues. And again, clearly this pandemic is impacting the public realm in cities very differently. But I think that there is one common strain. It's this equity thread. And so I think Charles raises a really great point about how we're experiencing this pandemic very differently, not just in America between the color of your skin, not just your zip code, but even down to the census tract level or the building in which you live. And I'm curious to hear from, Marcella, Maria, Robin, you touched upon this a little bit, being a North American neighbor, but in South America, in South Africa, in Greece, elsewhere around Europe, how is that dynamic playing out right now? Are you seeing that same disparity along race and class lines that we're seeing in America? I'll open that up to anybody.
I'll start. Absolutely. In South Africa happens to be a place where inequality is very dire. So, one of the things that, in fact, Colombia and South Africa share is that great level of social inequality. And so what you find in a city like Cape Town, which is where I am right now, is that in the city center, you have, a population that's quite affluent. And I live in the city center, so I will include myself, have access to places like parks and promenades and streets that are relatively safe. And then the majority lives in townships. And because of apartheid urban planning, this means that they are 20, 30 kilometers away from the city center, separated by highways. So, these are the contrasts. We have been in lockdown, very strict lockdown, and for the past 2 months, we have been allowed to go out only between 6 and 9 a.m. to exercise. So you can imagine what that means for those different realities. So people who can go and run by the sea, and then you have people who incidentally are also using public space, they're using streets to exercise, but the pictures are extremely different. And that is one of those conflicts that we are contending with. And those are the conversations that are starting to emerge, especially as lockdown reaches a level where we have less restriction in mobility. So it starts on Monday, literally. So we'll see how that plays out.
How about you, Maria?
Yeah,
Something to share from Europe?
Can you hear me? I think I have an issue with my connection. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you.
Great.
Yes.
Thank you. So what we see from here is that different places, neighborhoods are very overbuilt compared to other places with backyards and with bigger parks. So it is again an issue, like what is the accessible public space for different neighborhoods within the city. And also just to mention an example from here in Thessaloniki, the largest public space that we have, which is the new waterfront, was actually closed. They closed it down and it was the only public space that many neighborhoods could be could have a walk or be closer to nature. And this had the impact of having more people staying in or being crowded in very, very small public spaces that weren't actually giving them the time and the space to enjoy the outdoors. So this is why exactly I raised the point for the role of the street, because the streets need to be considered in a different way as they do function as a recreational space at the same time while being all those other functions.
Right. Charles, you wanted to weigh in? I know you put your hand up there.
I didn't know I put my hand up. I'll weigh in. Yeah, what was your question again, Mike? Repeat your question because I sort of kicked it off. So,
well, the question was that, North America, I was building off of your point that we're seeing very clear lines of impact based on race and class here in the United States and as a result of the pandemic. And so I was curious to see if those same lines or South America as we're seeing in North America.
Yeah, so one of the things I think is needed, and I'm so happy to be here and provide this perspective. Within the planning realm, we usually speak in very general terms. For instance, what's dangerous to our field in terms of protecting the most vulnerable is that we don't speak truth to power. We don't call a spade, as we would say in a Black barbershop. Yes, it is true that low-income and minority communities are suffering disproportionately. But we know as a social scientist, what is really true is that it is low-income Black and Latino residents who are suffering disproportionately. And so when we just say low-income and minority, what we're doing is we are falsely equating the experiences within those subgroups. And those disparities are not the same. So I think one of the things I would like to do today for those on this panel, as well as those listening in, is sort of challenge us to speak clearly about who is being victimized and who is being oppressed. In the American context, it is Black, Hispanic, and Native Americans who are suffering disproportionately. It does us no justice whatsoever to say minorities are being suffered or are suffering disproportionately. We must call out the racial and ethnic groups that are suffering, so that when we are creating these policies and procedures to eradicate these disparities, we can allocate resources to those very communities as best as we can. So I think we have to kind of clean up the language so that it is clear moving forward who is oppressed.
That's a great point about precision and language. And I think moving more towards a proactive response that tackles those challenges and issues. I'd like to turn over to Robin really quickly. And you mentioned this resource that's been developed in Canada that has very specific actionable items on it. Can you share just a couple points perhaps on this topic about equity, the public realm, and impact? Because I think everyone is understanding, I think, more and more that this has become a really emergent and critical issue that was related to the pandemic. It was clearly present before the pandemic, but how is your group, in terms of those who co-signed that document, moving that forward to actually practical solutions on the ground? They're going to start to amend for the concerns that we've voiced today.
Well, I mean, I should say that it's a living document. It's the start of a conversation, which I think is really important to acknowledge. I think Charles was really highlighting the fact that we can be exclusive in these conversations, and if we're going to go about making proclamations about what's going to be happening, there is risk to how that can exclude other people and the most vulnerable. So, I mean, it's a wide-ranging list. I don't have it memorized, but I know that there is emphasis on sustainability. I mean, this pandemic was caused by and is amplified by the effects of climate change, which disproportionately affects marginalized peoples. And so thinking about urban or active transportation in transit and better land use planning within the context of climate change, we can also start to think about ways to mitigate the effects that this pandemic actively is causing. But it's actually this morning, someone released, I think the city of Toronto released a map of the most cases in the city, and they labeled this as visible minorities. And I know that there's complexities within that term, but as far as I know at this point, it's the poorest visible minorities are affected the most. And putting my healthcare cap on, the way I'm looking at this, obviously there are implications of how these areas are designed in terms of their density, access to transit, and active transportation. But I think the other thing that's really important to recognize, and I'm sure this extends to many countries, but the Canadian context is who are our essential workers, who are the people out there on the front lines working in healthcare, working in care facilities for the elderly, which is also something that came out this week, that the state of affairs when it comes to our long-term care facilities are terrible. People who are typically working in those places, who, based on my experiences working as an occupational therapist and collaborating with these people, are people of color, people who are poor new Canadians, and they tend to live in these communities. So if we look at the effects of the pandemic within that context, and then look at how their neighborhoods are planned and access they have, I think you can see how quickly these effects can be amplified and disproportionately affect people.
So yeah, right. And I want to turn to some of the solutions that cities are starting to develop, and these are coming from all sorts of angles at different scales. Maria mentioned Paris and what's happening in Athens. Obviously, many of I've been documenting very closely what cities have been doing across the globe in this regard and trying to respond to the crisis in both mobility and public spaces. And what I've seen is a very clear tension between the changes being made for them and who they're intended for, right? Oh, can you hear me? Is it clear? Sorry, my Zoom just said I was unstable.
Yeah, you cut out for a second.
All right, I'll go back a minute. So there's very clear, there's clarity now that where a lot of the actions that have been taken by cities are in places where it may not be needed. And then there's the tension that if you're in a neighborhood that might need an open street and need access to open space, you might not be asking for it because it may not be something that, one, you know what to ask for specifically or know it's available. Or two, it's just literally not your concern to go out for a walk if you're trying to survive day to day going to and from the hospital and are going on transit or the subway or putting you and yourself and your family at risk. It may not seem like this is an important thing to advocate for in my community, to go out on, you know, a bike with my kid on a Sunday. And that is something we've seen very clearly in New York City. You know, we've got all these maps and all this data that's showing where and who is being impacted. And then you see the city response and where open streets gets rolled out to provide more open space for us in the city. And it's directly located either adjacent to parks or it's in neighborhoods that have been advocating and asking for it and already have that access. And there's a really challenging issue there between not having loud voices calling for this in the neighborhoods that may need it the most and where it's going in. And so I want to kind of sort through that tension a little bit and would love your reactions and responses to this issue. And maybe if we have people working in cities who are considering changes, give them some advice on how to think about this in an equitable way to deal with these challenges. And then I'll turn it over to those who are asking questions via the Zoom chat. I know that's a meaty one, but I think it's kind of hard at what I wanted to discuss today.
Well, Mike, I had the pleasure of working with you on the Jersey City Bike Master Plan. And not to toot our own horn there, but I think we did a great job in the creation of that plan in centering and prioritizing equity, not only in the distribution of the infrastructure and the resources, but also trying to ensure that all of the community and engagement activities were done in an equitable fashion as well. So part of this is about lifting the voices of the underserved. With that project, I think we did that. We outlined the areas that were communities of concern, and to my knowledge, resources have been directed that way. I think though, what we also have to do is address this at a policy level. Too quickly in our profession, we like to go to infrastructure without changing the policy dynamics within a local government. One of the things that I like that is happening out west is the city of Oakland has a racial equity action plan, which takes a look at the disparities through a racial lens across several different variables. And what that is doing is cementing and benchmarking in time what the current status is in regard to certain equity variables, and then giving you the ability to track the progress over time so that not only the city, but also residents within the city have the ability to see how well government is responding to their needs through the lens of race. Other cities are doing a dynamic job as well, but I think too often, again, we go straight to policies and programs, not policies, but plans and programs without addressing the policies and the decision-making that leads to those very plans and programs being developed. So I'll pause there and let others weigh in.
Yeah. Maria, do you want to chime in? Because I have a question about Athens. You know, we've been communicating the last several weeks on some of these issues, and Athens is doing kind of a tremendous, you know, undertaking tremendous measures in the city center. How is that being received in other neighborhoods, and what do you think the longer term outcome around equity is going to be in the public realm based on the decisions being made today?
Yeah, well, that's true. It's a tremendous area and it is a very ambitious plan. The thing here is that it is a plan that it has been there in the discussion for like more than 2 decades. So people were expecting it. So we have two different things here. The one thing is Athens as a landmark, as the historic city center that people and tourists want to walk around. So this is why they would like more pedestrian areas. And on the other hand is how actually the locals get to the city center. This was a good opportunity to start thinking of this plan, but at the same time, it's very unequal on what is going on regarding the rest of the city and what is going on how they have ensured the commuting of people of going to the city center for work. Because just considering because of COVID, we have people not wanting, and of course that's reasonable, to get on public transport. So this is like a huge gap that they still need to figure it out. There's not much answers yet regarding this issue, And it feels a little bit more like an opportunity to move forward with an ambitious plan rather than being responsive to COVID. But yet we need to hear more about it. They will begin piloting mid-June. However, I think it is an opportunity now because they will be implementing in parts and in temporary ways. So they will be using actually tactical urbanism in implementing parts of the plan, which could be an opportunity of people to interact. So this, in another case, wouldn't happen because that was the plan and they would move forward with constructing. So we see an opportunity of citizen engagement in a new type of way that we haven't seen it yet in big cities in Greece. So we're just waiting to see, but there are no other plans regarding the neighborhoods, which is the sad part. And I just wanted to add something to what Charles had mentioned about equity and what we see here in Greece, because the public space is not of very high quality in the overbuilt areas and in city centers as well, is that we have an issue of accessibility. And there is not equal opportunity to people with different abilities. And this is something also to keep in mind. So we might have public spaces, but they're not accessible to everyone. And those people suffered also a lot during these times because they wouldn't have the access to go to places and enjoy the outdoors.
Robin, do you want to chime in on this just from the perspective of mental health? And I think overlapping that with some of Maria's, expertise, which is around children, children indoors for 60 days in Spain. What kind of impact is that going to have on society, on these children in these neighborhoods that both were indoors for so long and also may also lack resources in public space and open space moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, when I was an occupational therapist, I worked in a learning and development clinic. So I worked with kids with mental health issues and learning and behavioral challenges. And I was part of an initiative called the Alberta Family Wellness Initiative. And it was focused on understanding the implications of early childhood development on long-term mental health. I mean, there's a lot of cohort studies, population-based studies that track kids and understand how their, the environmental context and access to all types of resources lead to mental illness in the long term. And I think something that we're all probably, this pandemic is making us all realize, particularly the privileged, is how the stress of the pandemic, how the lack of social opportunities for these kids, like those were issues before this pandemic, typically for poor people of color. A few kind of psychological theories. I mean, there's the theory of attachment. So early relationships, how the child has access to multiple attachment figures shapes their neural development. So some theorists in this area suggest that, we're seeing an epidemic or an increase in attachment related disorders like ADHD, all sorts of childhood anxiety, because we're living in a stressed society where all the burden on caregiving is typically placed on the mother in heterosexual relationships. And typically if you look at that within the context of, if they're poor, they're working all the time, they don't have the opportunity to give their kids the social contact. Kids need contact to develop. It's just something that we know. So thinking about that in the context of the pandemic, where everyone's worried about how their kids are gonna have or develop in relation to being around other kids and other people, I mean, I'm a little concerned about it, but I think that the problem is that this was a problem before this whole thing started. I've had three friends who just had babies and they're all worried about it. I mean, with everything that we know about child development and the long-term impacts. I mean, so I think the conversation is how do we allow kids to be around people in a safe way? Obviously, the urban realm is a big factor in that, particularly for people who don't have access to private backyard space. So I don't know. I mean, I'm a little concerned about it, and I think it's going to be a while before we know what the actual impacts are. And so thinking about child development within the context of urban design it's essential.
Right. Okay. Thank you. I'm going to turn to the questions here. I think maybe we can start perhaps with Marcella, and of course, you guys feel free to weigh in here. But Abir asks, public spaces as demonstrated by most of the speakers is kind of a privilege and a luxury when the underprivileged lack that space. So we've been discussing that, obviously. Sorry, I just scroll back up. Public spaces in informal areas are the street and the leftover spaces between buildings. So it's not really the traditional square, park, plaza that some of us get to enjoy in our neighborhoods. These are the living spaces and cannot be considered as public in the same meaning as public spaces in urban areas. How do we deal with this issue? So I don't know, Ms. Marcella, if you want to touch upon that a little bit from your experience in Bogota and Cape Town and elsewhere.
Sorry, I wasn't sure if you could hear me. I mean, I think one of the big issues that we've seen in Cape Town, as I said, I've been involved in a community response to COVID. And, the question is, what are the emerging needs? They're food, people are hungry, they're unemployed. And so, there are community kitchens emerging and they spill onto the street. Because if we are to keep physical distance, then, a lot of the spaces are reduced. So there are some practicalities to how public space is having to be used. And it's been interesting to just kind of hear anecdotes. There is a gentleman from a township called Guguletu who, aware of this need of the soup kitchens spilling onto the street, he wanted to kind of mark the sidewalk so that people could keep that distance, but he didn't want to get in trouble. We live in a society, in a city that's highly regulated. And so, he contacted even the mayor. I mean, he was very proactive, went to all the different instances, and he eventually got a permit. The interest was such that the clinic in that township went to him and said, actually, we need your help because we need to have our clinic inside the clinic demarcated. And so, there's this sort of that reality where people are taking initiative out of need. So I anticipate that we're going to see a lot more of that sort of organic response to what is required. Aware that we, as I explained earlier, we live in two cities really in Cape Town. But the one other point I wanted to make, just in terms of pre-existing conditions, no pun intended, in terms of our cities, Bogota has become quite well known because of ciclovia and sort of that cycling culture. And we all hear, that these temporary bikes have been extended. There are lots of bicycle initiatives, but safety continues to be an issue. I mean, I read a very sad story of a nurse who died in the last couple of days because somebody tried to steal her bike. And this is the reason why a lot of people didn't cycle in Bogota for a long time. I mean, I lived there last year, and the infrastructure is there. It's not perfect, but it's there. But safety is a huge issue. And so, just to say that there are those, that doesn't just go away. And because that social tension increases because of unemployment and all the things that we know, we just need to do more of what we know is required. Yeah, those are some thoughts.
Yeah, that's interesting. I guess I want to circle back to your point about the clinic, and the clinic starts to use space, and the available space is the street. And so I think there's also this emerging tension around the globe, and it really splits public space, advocates and professionals into kind of camps. One, it seems to be that, well, we don't want restaurants and private, enterprise to be able to take over the public realm and leave very little left that isn't organized around buying or selling and transacting, that's a real threat. And there's another camp, I think, that says this is the only way these businesses are going to be able to get through this, and they need to have that space because we can't put the same number of people indoors. So is that an issue that's starting to emerge in Cape Town or elsewhere? And again, everyone feel free to weigh in on that too, but I'm curious from Marcella what you have to say on that.
I mean, it is, I suppose the clinic is an example. The soup kitchens are a really great example because people are on the sidewalks and that's it. I mean, one of the things that I was curious, there's a very controversial thing happening here where religious gatherings are being allowed starting on Monday, but no other sort of gathering is allowed. And I was curious to hear if maybe there was going to be some sort of permission being given for religious services happening in public space. I haven't heard anything yet, so that isn't yet happening. So I would stick to the soup kitchens alone for now. because restaurants are not allowed to open or anything like that. We haven't kind of gotten into that conversation just yet.
Understood. Does anybody else want to weigh in on that point before I move on to another question?
Mike, I lost part of the question. I'm sorry, because I had a bad connection. So if you want.
Yeah, it's just recognize there's a tension between allowing more of the street to be used by private enterprise to help them recover economically, and the tension between the free use of the full street, if you could, without having to buy and transact. And there's a tension there, I think, between public space advocates on how far do we go, and the economic question versus the usability question.
Great. I thought that would have been the question, but just making sure, because here in Greece, it is a major issue. We do, because of the good weather and because of, I don't know, our behaviors in general, we do enjoy a lot of cafes and restaurants, and the public life is quite vibrant. And it means that lots of public space and sidewalks are taken over by tables. And there was a huge conflict because of, on the one hand, the government and the local authorities wanted to give more space, so those places would have more, because they have been closed for 2 months, so they would have the ability to actually get back to work. But at the same time, because we have limited public space and very narrow sidewalks, it was that conflict of what about the people and moving around. And we see, unfortunately, here in Greece, that those businesses are being a priority rather than the sustainable mobility. So we are there currently in our country, and it is a huge conflict. And I think that there needs to be a lot more citizen engagement in all those decisions about the policies and temporary interventions that we're taking upon, because every place is a different place and every neighborhood is different. So just to ensure that everyone has what he needs, it's that we need to have more interaction.
Yeah, and that's a great point. I think something that people in our shoes have struggled with in the last several months is the engagement balance, and doing that fairly and openly and transparently with the need to respond in crisis. And again, that's another one of these tensions that has been laid bare by the pandemic. And I've been seeing that issue come up time and time again in communities where cities feel like they're compelled to act out of necessity, but then there's pushback because communities feel like it's being put onto them, or there's changes being made that were not initially asked for. So to pivot to the other end of this age spectrum, we talked about children. We've got a question from Mallory that says, on the other end of this spectrum, how is the pandemic impacting elders in our countries? Do the living patterns in other countries better provide for older persons than it does in the US? Thinking of our nursing homes in particular, are there lessons about elder access to public space that we can learn from? So I'll open that one up to the panelists.
I can go. Yeah, so when I was an occupational therapist, I spent a lot of time working in long-term care facilities and with the elderly, typically the most vulnerable, poor and neglected. And right now, what we're seeing, so the Canadian government just sent the army in Ontario to look at the conditions of long-term care facilities, and it's terrible. It's embarrassing, but it's something that we've all been complicit in. This is what happens when they're publicly funded long-term care facilities, but they're driven with a profit motive. So it's a disaster, and I think something, using a psychological lens on this, if anyone, of the loneliest in our communities, I know everyone's feeling lonely right now. These people have been lonely forever. They have very little social contact with others. And now the social contact that they desperately need is putting them at risk because they're extremely just physically vulnerable to COVID. So, I think it's pretty terrible, and we need to think about ways to obviously improve the conditions in which they're living, but try to understand how we can get them more engaged in public spaces so that they can just be around people. It's just a basic human need. And I think the way one way of going about that is obviously creating more space in our communities, but ensuring that it's, physical distancing is particularly important for the vulnerable. And if this is going to be another 18 to 24 months of intermittent physical distancing, we're going to have to it's basic human rights, and yeah, we have to consider that.
So to that degree, we have a question here from Anonymous, which is, how should public spaces be opened safely, right? Because we recognize that in the US and Canada, the status is maybe very different than in Europe or the timeline of Cape Town or South Africa, right? So in countries where the lockdown has been stringent, the scarce availability of public space is also restricted. However, as and when the relaxations are applied, how should these public spaces be designed to change usual behaviors of crowding and extensive social and physical interactions?
I'll make a comment on this. I think that there's the ideal and then there's reality. And one of the biggest tensions in this country around the lockdown have been that 2 months ago, when this very stringent lockdown started, there were only a few people who were able to observe that, because the majority can't work from home. The majority lives on a day-to-day, in terms of income, and so there are many where lockdown has effectively been non-operational. People haven't been observing, that physical distancing. So there are ideas, and I kind of refer back to the new ways of informing each other, raising awareness. It's been really incredible to see how creativity has been used as a tool to talk to your neighbor and remind them, and look at vulnerable populations, elders, orphans, so there's that sort of proactive citizenry, if you will. And then there's the law, yes, and then by the law, you need to have a mask every time you go outside, and you have to observe the distance. So I just feel like, we need to strike a balance between what is realistic in places where density is really high. And so through creative, ways of informing each other is the only way that we can try to stay safe, and then what government expects. So as I said, because only on Monday we start to see a less stringent lockdown, we'll really see how this actually plays out.
Right, stay tuned.
If I may add to that, speaking from a place that we don't have lockdown right now, and what we saw is that people were really looking forward to the day that they will be back outdoors, and there's no physical distancing, no. And I think that at some places it also is more like a little bit of shaming. Like, so people think that COVID is over, and it's not. So if someone is more reluctant to go out, there is that feeling that he should be ashamed of being worried about COVID. So it is a little bit of strange tension, and it is because the public spaces are not designed to encourage us to keep this physical distance. So people, are acting a little bit more loose now. But I totally agree with Marcela that we need to have more like contact person to person to actually convince how we can keep the physical distancing and then keep doing our regular routine.
Right.
Mike, I would add that, in most places around the US as well as around the world, space is a luxury. The ability to social distance is a luxury. And so whatever we do in terms of opening safely, it should not be a one-size-fits-all approach. What we really have to do is work at the community or the neighborhood level to understand what those unique challenges are and respond accordingly. But again, the biggest mistake we can make is creating a plan that we think applies to all communities across the US and across the world. So we have to be very careful in our consideration of the importance of context.
That's a great point, Charles, and it's one that I think backs up Maria's initial question when she provided her summary of what about the neighborhood, what happens at that scale? Because neighborhood to neighborhood can be so different, not just within obviously a city, but across the country and the globe. I'm going to take away one more question, and I'm going to try to point it towards Charles. We're at 1 o'clock, so we're just about to wrap up. But I wanted to bring this up in terms of being solutions oriented or thinking about ways forward. And Shannon asks, New Zealand recently adopted a new model, a well-being budget that establishes direct policies aimed to help the disenfranchised, link health to the environment, and all above economic growth. Does anyone know about that program? And Charles or others, do we have models that we need to start pointing to either in the US or globally that you know of that deal with some of those issues more holistically, kind of on a global level, but then down to the fine grained approach about how they're applied at a local level?
I was not aware of that model. Thank you for sharing that. I think this is where the importance of having these international panels, come in handy, where you can learn from each other, peer-to-peer networking. So I wasn't aware. The point I want to make here is that we know prior to COVID, low income, and I want to stress that when I say low income, I know most of us have been socialized to believe that I'm speaking of minorities when I say low income, but low income also includes the white population and other population as well. So low income is strictly that. If you're low income, regardless of your race or ethnicity, I mean you as well. But what we know is that low income and minority communities have been disinvested in by way of infrastructure. We know that as a result of that now, and many other structural and systemic issues, they're also now disproportionately more likely to, suffer from COVID. So a simple solution to me is one that now disproportionately awards these communities with the resources they need to strive forward. So some may say, is Charles calling for reparations? The short answer is yes, I am. Reparations in terms of cash payments directly to those who have been victimized, as well as infrastructure investments in these communities. Because I think by doing those two things and many others, we'll sort of mitigate some of the things that have happened over time. But that's at least a start. I don't know any community that's doing that in a way sufficient enough for me to give you as a case study. But I'll look at New Zealand as a model to see if that's sufficient enough to share with others in terms of what I'm looking for. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Charles. Any final comments from the panel before I close this out here?
I have a really quick, I guess, using the psychological lens again. I feel like the social climate that we create in our cities around physical distancing is really important to consider. I feel like we're shaking a can. And so I think to make this sustainable, we have to think about ways to, obviously, using an equity lens, but we have to think about ways to give people opportunities to be out in their communities, because if we create this system where it's like a binary approach to we're either in lockdown or we're not, people are going to get really frustrated and then they're going to stop caring. And I'm worried about the implications that has, especially considering it's a socially communicated disease. And so just for the decision makers or anyone else paying attention to this or watching this webinar, think about how we make this psychologically sustainable for people. If it's going to be up the next 2 years, at some point people might just snap. And I think that's something that we have to be concerned about.
Okay, well, thank you, Charles. Thank you, Marcella. Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Robin. We can only scratch the surface on this conversation, obviously in 1 hour, but I want to respect people's time. Thank you for everyone who participated today. And I need to do my duty of reminding everyone on this webinar that CNU is holding its annual conference. Hope you can still see my screen. The registration link and to learn more is there in front of you, cnu.org/CNU28. We can continue this conversation there through many different types of presentations and talks. They'll be focused on all sorts of issues, including equity and public space. So with that, I want to say thank you to our panel. Thanks to CNU, and I look forward to seeing you all hopefully in person sometime in the near future. And take care.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.